The champagne glass slipped in Jonathan's hand the moment he saw Evelyn standing at the bottom of the marble staircase inside the Fontainebleau ballroom. She was wearing a plain black dress, no diamonds, no dramatic entrance, just the old gold bracelet her grandmother always wore. Vanessa tightened her grip around Jonathan's arm and smiled for another camera. Then Jonathan walked straight toward his wife. "You really came?" he asked. Evelyn didn't answer. He looked her up and down, then gave that same little laugh he used whenever he wanted to hurt her in public. "You look sad, Evelyn. Honestly, this is getting embarrassing. Did you come here to remind me what bad decisions look like?" Vanessa laughed. Somewhere behind them, a waiter stopped moving. Evelyn looked at Jonathan for a long second. There was nothing left in her face for him. Not anger, not pain, nothing. Then she glanced down at the silver gown Vanessa was wearing, the same one she had once circled in a magazine and left on the kitchen counter. "Enjoy your evening, Jonathan." And when she walked away, people all across the ballroom turned to watch her. Jonathan didn't understand why, not yet. Welcome to Mr. Kingswell Stories, where powerful life lessons come through unforgettable stories about love, betrayal, family, and second chances. If you're new here, subscribe and join us for more stories that make you think differently about life. And before we begin, tell me in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. The ballroom swallowed Evelyn the second she turned away from Jonathan. Behind her, she could still hear Vanessa's laugh. Too loud, too practiced. The kind of laugh that wanted everyone nearby to notice it. Evelyn kept walking across the polished floor of the Fontainebleau ballroom, her hand brushing lightly against the old gold bracelet on her wrist. Her grandmother's bracelet. The clasp was loose. Lorraine had been meaning to fix it for years. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne. Someone near the stage called, "Evelyn." She turned, but before she could answer, the room blurred for just a second. Not from tears. She had done enough crying already. It was the silver dress. Vanessa was wearing the same silver gown Evelyn had circled in a magazine 6 months earlier and left on the kitchen counter beside a half-finished cup of coffee and a stack of unopened mail. Jonathan had walked through the kitchen that morning without looking at her. "You still keeping those?" he'd asked, nodding toward the magazine. "I like the dress." "You don't go anywhere," he'd said. Then he'd grabbed his keys and left. Now another woman was wearing it. Evelyn looked down at the black dress she had on instead. Simple, elegant. The dress Lorraine had worn 20 years ago, to the same gala. She took a slow breath. Then the story of how she got here came back all at once. 6 years earlier, before the house in Coconut Grove, before the cold dinners and locked phones and sharp little comments, she had been standing barefoot in the middle of a flooded apartment in Coral Gables, trying not to cry. Water dripped from the kitchen ceiling into a soup pot on the floor. The pipe under the upstairs sink had burst sometime while she was at work. By the time she got home, the tiny apartment smelled like wet drywall and mildew. The pale yellow paint she'd spent all weekend putting on the walls had bubbled and peeled in long strips. Evelyn sat on the edge of the kitchen counter in one of Jonathan's old college t-shirts and stared at the damage. "This is fine," she said quietly to herself. "It's just paint." Then the front door opened. Jonathan stepped inside carrying 2 large coffees and a toolbox. He took one look at the ceiling, then looked at her. "Oh," he said. "Wow, this place looks terrible." Evelyn stared at him. For one awful second, she thought he was serious. Then he grinned. "Good news, though. I've always wanted to date a woman who lives in a swamp." Despite herself, she laughed. Jonathan set the coffees down, crossed the room, and kissed the top of her head. "We'll fix it. It smells disgusting in here." "Yeah, honestly, I think the mildew's already starting to attack my lungs." She laughed again. That night, they stayed up until almost 4 in the morning. Jonathan borrowed fans from his brother and dragged furniture into the living room. He spread old towels across the floor and watched 3 different videos about repairing water damage even though he had no idea what he was doing. At 11:30, he came back from Home Depot with paint rollers, drop cloths, and 2 completely different shades of yellow. "You bought the wrong color." "No, I bought options," he said. "Jonathan, one of those is basically mustard." "Okay, first of all, rude." By midnight, there was paint on his hands, his jeans, and somehow the side of his face. At 2 in the morning, they sat on the kitchen floor, eating Cuban takeout from a place down the street because everything else was closed. The apartment smelled like paint, garlic, and sweet plantains. Jonathan pointed his fork at the wall. I think we really captured the feeling of emotional instability. The wall is crooked. The wall has depth. It's still crooked. So are we. She looked at him then, really looked at him. At 29, Jonathan had no money, no connections, and no idea what he was doing with his life half the time. But he had a way of making every bad thing feel smaller. When she lost her temper, he made her laugh. When she got quiet, he noticed. When she got scared, he stayed. After they finished painting, Jonathan found an old salsa playlist on his phone. We are not dancing in this apartment. We absolutely are. I'm covered in paint. You've never looked more beautiful. She rolled her eyes. He held out his hand anyway. The kitchen floor was still sticky from the leak. The overhead light flickered every few seconds. Somewhere outside, a car alarm went off and then stopped. But Jonathan pulled her close, and for a few minutes she forgot about the ruined apartment and the wet ceiling and the fact that they had exactly $213 in their checking account. He rested his forehead against hers. I've got you, he said quietly, and back then, she believed him. A year later, Lorraine called and mentioned she hadn't been sleeping well. She was still living alone in her old house near Biscayne Bay. Evelyn worried about her constantly. What she really wants, Evelyn said absent-mindedly one afternoon, while she and Jonathan were stuck in traffic on I-95, is peach cobbler. My grandmother thinks peach cobbler fixes everything. Jonathan glanced over from the driver's seat. Your grandmother likes peach cobbler? She loves it. 2 days later, Evelyn came home from work and found the apartment empty. No Jonathan, no note. At 6:30 her phone rang. Don't be mad, Jonathan said. Where are you? Okay, before you say anything, technically this is your fault. My fault? You told me Lorraine likes peach cobbler. Evelyn frowned. What are you talking about? I'm in Gainesville. Gainesville? There was this place online that everybody said had the best peach cobbler in Florida. And then I got here and the woman said they sold out, so now I'm driving to another place. Evelyn sat down slowly on the couch. You drove 3 hours for peach cobbler? 4 now, actually. Traffic was bad. Jonathan. What? I want your grandmother to like me. Lorraine called that night after he finally got there. I think you better marry this man, she said. In the background, Evelyn could hear Jonathan laughing, while Lorraine complained that he had brought too much food. Later that night, when Jonathan finally came home, exhausted and smelling like coffee and highway gas station French fries, he dropped down beside Evelyn on the couch. Did she like it? Evelyn smiled. She loved you. Jonathan leaned his head against her shoulder. Good, he said softly. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the apartment windows. Evelyn looked over at him. This man who drove across half the state because of one small thing she had said without thinking. The man who stayed. The man who listened. The man who made her feel safe. She rested her head against his and thought, with the absolute certainty only love can give you, that she had married the kindest man she had ever known. Evelyn found out she was pregnant on a Tuesday morning in early October. She had stopped at the pharmacy near Miracle Mile on her way home from work because she was late and tired and suddenly crying over a dog food commercial. The test sat on the bathroom sink while she paced their bedroom in socks and one of Jonathan's old t-shirts. When she finally looked down, she had to sit on the edge of the bathtub. 2 pink lines. For a long time, she just stared at them. Jonathan came home an hour later carrying Thai takeout and talking too loudly about a contractor who kept missing deadlines. He stopped when he saw her sitting at the kitchen table. Evelyn? She looked up at him. She couldn't speak. She just slid the test across the table. Jonathan looked down at it, then back at her, then down again. For a second, he looked almost scared. You serious? She nodded. He put the takeout on the counter so fast, one of the containers tipped over. Evelyn. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps. She laughed because she didn't know what else to do. And then suddenly, she was crying. Jonathan wrapped his arms around her so tightly she could barely breathe. We're having a baby? I think so. He pulled back and looked at her like he was trying to memorize her face. Then he laughed. Then she laughed. Then they both stood there in the middle of the kitchen, holding each other and crying over cold pad thai and spilled peanut sauce. They didn't tell anyone. Not Lorraine, not their friends, not even Jonathan's brother. It felt too fragile, too new. Instead, they kept it between themselves. At night, they whispered in bed about names they would never actually use. Jonathan wanted ridiculous names. If it's a boy, hear me out. Apollo. No. Okay, Maverick. Absolutely not. You hate all my best work. You want our child to sound like a fighter pilot. He grinned. And you want them to sound like an 80-year-old accountant. By November, Jonathan had started stopping in front of baby clothes whenever they passed a store. One Saturday, while Evelyn was folding laundry, she opened Jonathan's dresser drawer looking for a missing sock. A tiny green and orange University of Miami football onesie sat folded in the back. She stared at it for a second. Then Jonathan walked into the room carrying coffee. He froze. You weren't supposed to see that yet. Evelyn picked it up carefully. It's so little. Jonathan rubbed the back of his neck. I know. There was something on his face she had never seen before. Not confidence, not charm, hope. He sat beside her on the bed. I know we said not to get ahead of ourselves, he said quietly. I saw it, and I couldn't help it. Evelyn rested the tiny onesie in her lap. Then Jonathan leaned over and pressed his hand gently against her stomach. For the first time in a long time, everything between them felt easy again. The miscarriage happened 3 weeks later. Evelyn was at work when the cramps started. At first, she told herself it was nothing. By the time she got to the hospital, she could barely stand. Jonathan got there 10 minutes later, still wearing his suit from work, his tie hanging loose around his neck. He found her sitting on the edge of the hospital bed with her hands wrapped around her stomach. Evelyn. The way he said her name made something inside her break. Later, after the doctor left, after the words, I'm sorry, had been said too many times, Evelyn sat in the narrow hospital bed staring at the wall. Jonathan sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Jonathan took her hand. We're gonna survive this, he said quietly. She turned and looked at him. His eyes were red. He looked exhausted, lost. But he held her hand all night. When they got home the next morning, Jonathan took the onesie out of the dresser drawer and put it in the back of the closet. He didn't say anything while he did it. Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched him. Then he shut the closet door, and somehow that hurt more than anything. After that, they stopped talking about babies. Not all at once. At first, it was small. They stopped making jokes about names. Jonathan stopped touching her stomach absent-mindedly when they stood in the kitchen. The extra bedroom stayed empty. The months passed. Winter became spring. Evelyn grew quieter without meaning to. She still went to work, still met friends for lunch sometimes, still smiled when people asked how she was, but there was a heaviness in her now. Some nights she stood in the shower long after the water turned cold. Jonathan changed too. At first he seemed determined to stay busy because he didn't know what else to do. He worked later, took more meetings, started talking constantly about growing the company. If I can just land this next project, he would say, or, I'm doing this for us. Evelyn wanted to believe him, but the more successful Jonathan became, the less he seemed to know how to sit still with anything painful. If she brought up the miscarriage, he got quiet. If she cried, he held her for a minute and then found a reason to leave the room. One night, nearly a year later, Evelyn sat cross-legged on their bed folding towels while Jonathan answered emails beside her. The glow from his laptop lit one side of his face. Do you ever think about it? She asked softly. Jonathan didn't look up. About what? She looked down at the towel in her lap. The baby. He was quiet for a second. Then he shut the laptop, harder than he meant to. Evelyn. What? I don't know what you want me to say. I don't want you to say anything. I just asked if you think about it. Jonathan stood up and walked toward the bathroom. Of course I think about it. Then why do you act like it never happened? He turned around. Because somebody has to keep moving. The room went quiet. Evelyn stared at him. Jonathan rubbed his hand over his face. You don't understand what pressure feels like. What does that mean? It means you grew up with money, Evelyn. You've always had somewhere soft to land. She looked at him like she didn't know him. Jonathan looked away first. Later that night, he apologized. Sort of. He kissed the top of her head and said he was stressed. She told herself he didn't mean it. She told herself grief had changed both of them. But after that, the space between them kept growing. By the end of the year, Jonathan was working late almost every night. At midnight, Evelyn sat alone in the kitchen in the dark. A mug of tea had gone cold beside her. Bills were stacked unopened on the counter. The TV played quietly in the next room, even though nobody was watching it. She heard Jonathan's car pull into the driveway. For a second, she thought about getting up to meet him at the door like she used to. Instead, she stayed where she was. And when Jonathan walked into the kitchen 10 minutes later, loosened tie, phone in his hand, he looked surprised to find her still awake. Jonathan stood in the kitchen doorway, with his suit jacket slung over one shoulder and his phone still glowing in his hand. "You okay?" he asked. Evelyn looked up from the cold tea. It was after midnight. The digital clock on the microwave said 12:17. The kitchen smelled faintly like the garlic chicken she had made hours ago and then thrown away when it got cold. "You said you'd be home by 9. Jonathan dropped his keys on the counter. "I know. You didn't call. I got busy." He said it the same way he said everything lately. Flat, distracted, like she was asking him for something unreasonable. Evelyn looked at him for a second. Then she stood up, carried her mug to the sink, and poured the untouched tea down the drain. By the next spring, Jonathan's company had grown faster than either of them expected. He bought a dark blue Range Rover, started wearing expensive watches, talked about investors and expansion and big opportunities while checking his phone through dinner. People called him successful now. Jonathan liked the sound of that. At first, Evelyn was proud of him. She had helped him build half of it. When he was still running the company from the tiny spare bedroom in their house, she had sat beside him at the kitchen table, helping him write proposals and organize budgets. She was the one who suggested the boutique hotel renovation project in Wynwood that ended up changing everything. Jonathan had looked at her across the table that night and said, "You're a genius." Now, when he told the story at parties, he left that part out. One Friday night, they went to dinner at a friend's house in Coral Gables. The dining room was too cold from the air conditioning, and somebody had lit one of those expensive candles that smelled like cedar and orange peel. Jonathan was halfway through his second glass of wine when one of the men at the table asked how his latest project was going. Jonathan smiled. "Actually, it was Evelyn who gave me the idea." For a second, she looked up, surprised. Then he laughed. "I'm kidding. Evelyn's good with decorating. I handle the real business." A few people laughed politely. Evelyn smiled because that was easier than making everyone uncomfortable. But something in her chest tightened. Later, in the car, she stared out the passenger window while the streetlights slid across the windshield. "You embarrass me tonight," Jonathan said. She turned toward him. "I embarrassed you? You got quiet. You made me sound stupid." Jonathan let out a sharp breath. "Oh my God, Evelyn, it was a joke." It didn't feel like a joke. Everything doesn't have to be so serious. She looked back out the window. The next few months were full of moments like that. Small enough to explain away, sharp enough to leave a mark. Jonathan started interrupting her when she talked. At dinners, he would answer questions for her before she had a chance to speak. If she offered an opinion about business, he corrected her. If she disagreed with him in front of people, he waited until they were alone to punish her for it. One night, they hosted drinks at their house. A contractor asked Evelyn what she thought about a deal Jonathan was considering. Before she could answer, Jonathan smiled and put his hand on the small of her back. "You don't want Evelyn's opinion on numbers," he said. "She still thinks budgets are whatever fits on a Pinterest board." Everyone laughed. Evelyn laughed too. Then she walked into the kitchen and stood alone by the sink until she could breathe normally again. Lorraine noticed. A week later, Evelyn was sitting on Lorraine's back porch in Coconut Grove while the two of them drank iced tea and watched the water. Lorraine sat wrapped in a pale blue cardigan, despite the heat. "That man is getting too comfortable talking down to you," she said. Evelyn looked over. "You heard that one story, and suddenly you're ready to kill him." Lorraine gave her a look. "I've been watching him for years. He's under a lot of pressure. So are you. It's not the same." "No," Lorraine said quietly. "It isn't." Evelyn looked down at the condensation sliding down her glass. "I think he's just unhappy." Lorraine didn't answer right away. Then she said, Some people only know how to feel strong by making somebody else feel small. Evelyn wanted to argue. Instead, she changed the subject. By the end of the summer, Jonathan had started coming home later and later. When he was home, he seemed restless. He spent longer in front of the mirror, started getting facials at some place in Brickell, bought shirts that looked too young for him, and cologne so expensive, Evelyn almost laughed when she saw the receipt. "You smell different," she said one morning. Jonathan straightened his tie in the hallway mirror. "That bad?" "No, just different." He smiled at his reflection instead of at her. One Thursday night, Evelyn waited for him to come home because she wanted to tell him Lorraine's doctor had called. They thought Lorraine might need surgery. Jonathan finally walked through the front door close to 11. He looked irritated before she even spoke. "You said you'd be home." "I had a meeting." "You always have a meeting." Jonathan dropped his briefcase on the floor. "Can we not do this tonight? I just wanted to talk to you." "I know. You always want to talk." The words sat between them. Evelyn stared at him. "What is that supposed to mean?" Jonathan ran both hands through his hair. "It means I am tired, Evelyn." "I'm tired too." "No, you're not." Her face changed. "What?" "You have no idea what it's like carrying everything." She took a step back. "Carrying everything? My name is on the company. If something goes wrong, it's on me." "Our company." Jonathan laughed once. "Come on." Evelyn went still. "What does that mean?" "It means you don't understand what this is like. I helped you build it. You helped decorate the office." For a second, she honestly thought she had misheard him. Jonathan looked away the second the words left his mouth, but he didn't take them back. They slept on opposite sides of the bed that night. Jonathan fell asleep quickly. Evelyn lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly in the dark. Around 2 in the morning, she heard Jonathan's phone buzz on the nightstand. He reached for it so quickly, it almost fell off the table. The screen lit up his face for half a second. Then, he turned away from her. The next morning, Jonathan was already in the bathroom when Evelyn woke up. The door was open a crack. She walked down the hallway quietly. Jonathan stood at the sink, staring at himself in the mirror. Whitening strips covered his teeth. An expensive bottle of cologne sat open beside the faucet. His phone was face down on the counter. He didn't know she was standing there. For a long moment, Evelyn watched him fixing his hair, adjusting his shirt, studying himself like he was getting ready for someone. Then his phone buzzed again. Jonathan grabbed it so fast he nearly knocked over the cologne, and something cold moved through Evelyn before she even knew why. Something cold moved through Evelyn before she even knew why. Jonathan shoved the phone into his pocket the second he saw her standing in the doorway. "You scared me. You grabbed your phone like it was on fire." Jonathan gave a quick laugh. It was work. At 7:30 in the morning, with whitening strips on his teeth and cologne still hanging in the air. Evelyn looked at him for a second. Then she nodded once. "Okay." But it wasn't okay. For the rest of the day, she couldn't stop thinking about the look on his face. Not guilt exactly, excitement. 3 nights later, Jonathan was at a business conference at the Mandarin Oriental in Brickell. At least, that was what he told Evelyn before he left. By then, he had started dressing differently. Sharper suits, younger ties, the kind of white sneakers that cost too much and looked uncomfortable. That night, Evelyn sat alone at the kitchen island eating leftover pasta out of a bowl, while the local news played quietly in the background. Jonathan texted once, "Running late, big client dinner, no heart, no period, just that." At the Mandarin Oriental bar, Jonathan loosened his tie and ordered a bourbon he didn't even really like. The conference had gone well. People had laughed at his stories, shaken his hand, told him his company was expanding fast. But somehow, it still didn't feel like enough. He sat alone for 10 minutes before he noticed the woman 2 stools away. She was wearing a cream-colored dress and scrolling through something on her phone. When the bartender sat a drink in front of her, she looked up and smiled. "Thank God," she said. "If I had to listen to one more man explain cryptocurrency to me, I was going to fake my own death." Jonathan laughed before he could stop himself. She looked over. "There you are," she said. "A normal person." Jonathan smiled. "I make no promises." She held out her hand. "Vanessa," Jonathan. Vanessa worked in luxury branding and social media marketing. She had a way of listening that made it feel like every word Jonathan said mattered. She asked him about his company. She leaned closer when he talked. When he made a joke, she laughed like he was the funniest man she had ever met. At one point, she touched his arm lightly and said, "You don't seem like the kind of man who stops until he gets exactly what he wants." Jonathan felt something sharp and satisfying move through him. By the time he left the bar, Vanessa had his number. By the end of the week, she had his attention. At first, Jonathan told himself it wasn't an affair. It was dinner, then drinks, then another dinner, because she happened to be in the same part of town. Vanessa texted him things Evelyn had stopped saying years ago. "You looked good tonight. I love the way your mind works. I don't think people realize how impressive you are." Jonathan started smiling at his phone, started turning it face down. When Evelyn walked into the room, he started staying later at the office, taking weekend conferences. One Friday, he told Evelyn he had to spend the night in Palm Beach for a client meeting. She stood in the closet folding laundry while he packed. "You need the blue suit?" she asked. Jonathan glanced over. "Yeah." She handed it to him. Then she noticed he had packed the expensive cologne, the one he only wore now. "You never used to care what you wore on business trips." Jonathan zipped the bag too quickly. "People notice that stuff." Evelyn looked at him. "Since when?" But she didn't say it. That weekend, Jonathan and Vanessa stayed at a resort in Palm Beach. Vanessa posted a picture of the ocean to her social media with a caption about escaping the noise. Jonathan wasn't in the photo, but his watch was. Evelyn saw it while she sat on the couch at Lorraine's house Sunday afternoon. Lorraine was asleep in her chair by the window. The television was on low. Evelyn stared at the picture for a long time. Then she put the phone down, face down beside her. She still said nothing. The next month, Jonathan spent more money than usual. A new watch, 3 expensive dress shirts, a monthly facial membership in Brickell, teeth whitening. Even his gym membership changed. "You joined a new gym?" Evelyn asked one morning when she saw the charge on their account. Jonathan poured coffee without looking at her. "The old one was too crowded." "You've gone there for years." "People change, Evelyn." The words stayed with her longer than they should have. People change. Maybe they did, or maybe they just stopped pretending. One Thursday night, Jonathan came home late and headed upstairs to shower. Evelyn sat at the kitchen counter, paying bills. The house was quiet, except for the sound of water running upstairs and the dishwasher humming. She clicked through the credit card statement without really paying attention. Then she stopped. A charge from a hotel in South Beach. The Setai, 2 nights, $2,340. Evelyn stared at the screen. Jonathan came downstairs 20 minutes later with damp hair and a fresh t-shirt. She was still sitting at the counter. He reached into the refrigerator for water. "Everything okay?" Evelyn turned the laptop toward him. "What's this?" Jonathan looked down. For a second, he froze. Then he picked up the water bottle. "Oh, that. It was a client dinner. A client dinner cost over $2,000. He unscrewed the bottle too fast and water splashed onto the counter. There were rooms involved. People stayed over. "Who?" Jonathan looked at her. "What? Who was there?" He looked away first. "You don't know them." The silence stretched between them. Evelyn watched him, watched the way he wouldn't meet her eyes, watched him take another drink of water, even though his hand was shaking slightly. He was lying, badly, and somehow that was worse, because he thought she was stupid enough to believe him. After a long moment, Evelyn closed the laptop. "Okay," she said quietly. Jonathan looked relieved too quickly. "I told you, it's work." She nodded. Then she stood up, carried her wine glass to the sink, and rinsed it carefully. Later that night, Jonathan fell asleep almost immediately. Evelyn lay beside him in the dark, listening to him breathe. At 2 a.m, she got out of bed. She walked downstairs barefoot and opened her laptop at the kitchen table. The house was silent. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Evelyn stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she created a new folder. She named it Private. The next Tuesday, Evelyn parked 3 blocks away from the office building, even though there was a garage underneath. She didn't want Jonathan seeing her car. The lawyer's office was on the 12th floor of a building in downtown Miami, with gray carpet and cold air conditioning that made everything feel more serious than she wanted it to. She sat at the end of a conference table with her purse in her lap, while a woman in a navy suit slid papers toward her. "You said you wanted discretion," the lawyer said. "Everything stays private." Beside her sat a forensic accountant with wire-rimmed glasses and a legal pad full of notes. Evelyn looked down at the papers. At first, it was small enough to explain away. Money moved from one account to another, charges on business cards, hotel rooms, jewelry, a luxury spa membership under Vanessa's name. Then it got worse. There were private accounts Evelyn had never seen, large transfers from their joint savings, business money being used to pay for trips, dinners, and gifts. The accountant tapped one line with his pen. This account was opened 8 months ago. Evelyn looked at the number. Jonathan had moved almost $300,000 into it. Quietly, without telling her, the room suddenly felt too cold. "He said we were being careful because of the market," she said softly. The lawyer didn't answer. She didn't need to. An hour later, Evelyn walked back to her car in silence. Downtown traffic crawled past her. A man argued into his phone on the sidewalk. Somewhere nearby, construction hammered against concrete. Everything looked normal. That was the strange thing. The world kept moving, even when your life quietly split in half. That night, Jonathan came home carrying flowers, white roses, her favorite. He set them on the counter, like they fixed something. "Long day?" he asked. Evelyn looked at the flowers. There had been a time when white roses would have made her cry. Now they just made her tired. "You didn't have to do that." Jonathan loosened his tie. "I know things have been weird lately." Weird. Like this was weather. Like this had happened to both of them, equally. He walked over and kissed the top of her head. For a second, Evelyn closed her eyes, because some part of her still remembered the man in the flooded apartment. The man with paint on his face and takeout at 2 in the morning. Then Jonathan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled away too fast. "I have to take this." He stepped out onto the patio. Through the kitchen window, Evelyn watched him smile at whatever Vanessa was saying. The next week, Evelyn learned more than she wanted to know. Jonathan had been telling people the company was entirely his, that he had built everything on his own, that Evelyn didn't understand business. One of the investors Lorraine had known for years called quietly to warn her. "I thought you should know what he's been saying." Evelyn sat in her office, staring at the skyline, while the investor's words echoed in her head. "He says everything belongs to him." By the time they were invited to dinner at a friend's house in Coconut Grove, Evelyn already felt like she was watching the end of her marriage happen from far away. The house sat on the water with string lights hanging over the backyard and music playing softly from inside. People stood around with wine glasses and little plates of grilled shrimp. Jonathan was in a good mood, which usually meant he had won something. A deal, a meeting, somebody else's attention. He had his hand on Evelyn's back when they walked in, the way he always did when other people were watching. To everyone else, they probably looked happy. Dinner started normally. Talk about work, vacations, somebody's son getting into college. Then one of the men at the table asked Jonathan how business was going. Jonathan leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Best year we've ever had." "That's amazing," somebody said. Jonathan lifted his glass. "Honestly, I got lucky." Evelyn looked at him. For 1 second, she thought maybe he was finally going to tell the truth. Then he laughed. "I mean, look at me, a wife like Evelyn, all this success." He shrugged. Most men with money would have left by now. The room went still. Nobody laughed. Evelyn could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner and silverware touching plates somewhere down the table. Jonathan looked around, still smiling, waiting for people to react. Vanessa wasn't there, but somehow Evelyn could still feel her. In the expensive shirts, the hidden phone, the way Jonathan only smiled at her now when somebody else was looking. Finally, one of the women at the table took a sip of wine and looked away. Evelyn smiled, not because she wanted to, because after years of marriage, she had learned exactly how to survive moments like this. You smiled. You made everybody else comfortable. You acted like your husband had not just humiliated you in front of people who used to respect him. Jonathan looked relieved when she smiled, like she had done her job. The drive home was quiet at first. Rain hit the windshield in soft, uneven taps. Jonathan drove too fast with one hand on the wheel. Finally, he sighed. "You made that awkward." Evelyn kept looking out the window. "I'm sorry?" "You sat there like I said something terrible." "You did." Jonathan laughed once. "Oh, come on. You think I should be grateful you stayed with me?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Jonathan tightened his hands on the steering wheel. "You've changed, Evelyn." She looked at him then. He kept his eyes on the road. "You used to be fun," he said. "You used to smile." The words landed harder than she expected, because part of her had spent years wondering if maybe he was right. Maybe she had become too quiet, too tired, too difficult to love. Then she looked at him, really looked at him. The expensive watch on his wrist, the sharp line of his jaw in the dashboard light. The man beside her, who had once driven 4 hours for peach cobbler because he wanted Lorraine to like him. He looked the same, but he wasn't. And suddenly, sitting in that car with rain running down the windows and Jonathan still talking about himself, Evelyn understood something she had been avoiding for a long time. The man she married was gone. Or maybe he had never been exactly who she thought he was. Jonathan was still speaking, something about how hard he worked, how nobody appreciated him. But Evelyn wasn't listening anymore. She turned back toward the window, and for the first time in years, she stopped trying to save the marriage. The next morning, Jonathan left before sunrise. Evelyn heard him moving around upstairs, heard the shower turn on, heard the closet door slide open and shut. She stayed in bed with her eyes closed until she heard the front door slam. Then the house went quiet. By 9 o'clock, she was driving through Coconut Grove with the windows down. Lorraine's house sat at the end of a narrow road lined with banyan trees and old stone walls. The house had belonged to Lorraine for more than 40 years. White stucco, green shutters, a wide back porch that looked over Biscayne Bay. Evelyn had spent half her childhood there. She parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a moment. She didn't know exactly what she was going to say, only that she was tired. Lorraine was already sitting on the back porch when Evelyn walked through the house. She had a blanket over her knees, even though it was warm outside. An old photo album sat open beside her. "You look awful," Lorraine said without looking up. Evelyn gave a tired laugh. "Good morning to you, too." Lorraine finally looked at her. Then she held out one hand. Evelyn sat down beside her. For a minute, neither of them spoke. The water moved slowly below the porch. Somewhere across the bay, a boat horn sounded. Then Lorraine said quietly, "What did he do?" And just like that, Evelyn started crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just tears she had been holding in for too long. Lorraine reached over and took her hand. They sat there for a while. When Evelyn finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller than she expected. "He's having an affair." Lorraine nodded once. "I know." Evelyn looked up. "You know?" "I didn't know for sure," Lorraine said. "But I know Jonathan." There was no anger in Lorraine's voice. That almost made it worse. Evelyn wiped at her face. "I kept thinking if I was patient enough," she said softly. "If I stopped pushing him, if I loved him better, maybe he'd come back." Lorraine closed the photo album in her lap. "Staying with someone who keeps hurting you will not make him love you better." Evelyn stared out at the water. "I know." "No," Lorraine said gently. "You know it in your head. You still don't know it in your heart." The words settled over them. After a minute, Lorraine opened the photo album again and turned it toward Evelyn. Inside were old black and white photographs. The first hotel Lorraine had bought in Miami in 1978, a restaurant opening in Little Haiti, a scholarship banquet, a ribbon cutting in Liberty City. There were pictures of Lorraine standing beside city officials and pastors and business owners. Then there were pictures of Evelyn, at 15, helping set up chairs for a charity event. At 23, standing in front of one of the foundation's housing developments with a hard hat on and paperwork in her hands. At 30, giving a speech at a fundraiser while Lorraine watched from the front row. "You remember this?" Lorraine asked. Evelyn smiled faintly. "The hotel on Collins Avenue. You stayed up for 2 days because the contractor quit. You yelled at me for trying to do everything myself. I was right." Evelyn laughed softly. For the first time in weeks, it felt real. The life she had before Jonathan, The parts of herself she had spent years making smaller because Jonathan always seemed uncomfortable whenever people talked about her family. Jonathan knew Lorraine had money. He knew the family owned property. But Evelyn had never told him everything. She never told him that Lorraine had built one of the largest black-owned hospitality and event foundations in South Florida. She never told him about the hotels, the restaurants, the investment partnerships, the housing developments, the scholarships. She never told him that most of the events Jonathan thought he had been invited to because of his own success were quietly connected to Lorraine. And she never told him what happened 6 months earlier. Lorraine reached into the table drawer beside her chair and pulled out a folder. She handed it to Evelyn. Inside were legal papers, ownership documents, foundation records. Evelyn stared at them. "You already know," Lorraine said. But somehow, Evelyn still needed to hear it. "When your mother died, everything was left to me," Lorraine said quietly. "When my health got worse, I transferred control." Evelyn looked up slowly. "You are already the majority owner of the foundation." The words hung in the air between them. Evelyn looked back down at the papers. She had signed some of them months ago while Lorraine was in the hospital, barely paying attention because all she could think about was keeping Lorraine safe. At the time, it hadn't felt real. Now, it did. Jonathan had spent years acting like he carried everything, like she needed him, like the life they had existed because he allowed it. And all this time, he had no idea who she really was, not because she lied, because he never cared enough to ask. Lorraine watched her quietly. "What are you going to do?" Evelyn looked out over the water. The answer came easier than she expected. "I'm done protecting him." Lorraine nodded once. "Good." A week later, Evelyn sat in a conference room with the lawyers and accountants. They spread papers across the table. Evidence of the money Jonathan had moved, records of the company accounts, partnership agreements. One by one, the people Jonathan depended on quietly stepped back. A bank delayed one of his loans. An investor pulled out of a project. 2 business partnerships tied to the foundation were frozen. Jonathan called Evelyn that evening sounding irritated. "I don't know what the hell is going on," he said. "People are acting weird." Evelyn stood in the kitchen looking out at the pool. "What do you mean?" "I mean nobody's returning my calls." He sounded angry, confused. For a second, she almost felt sorry for him. Then she remembered the silver dress, the hotel charge. Most men with money would have left by now. "You should probably figure that out," she said. Jonathan was quiet. Then he laughed once. "You're in a mood lately." Maybe she was, or maybe she was finally done being the person who made everything easier for him. 2 days later, an invitation to the Bennett Foundation Winter Gala arrived at the house. Jonathan left it on the kitchen counter without opening it. "Guess we have another one of these things," he said. Evelyn looked down at the envelope. Her full name was printed across the front. Evelyn Bennett Walker. Jonathan didn't notice. He was too busy answering a text. That night, after he went upstairs, Evelyn picked up the invitation and ran her thumb slowly across the thick cream paper. Then she called Lorraine. "I'm going to the gala," she said. Lorraine was quiet for a moment. "Good. And I'm going alone." This time, Lorraine smiled. Evelyn could hear it in her voice. For the first time in years, the idea didn't make her feel lonely. It made her feel free. For the first time in years, the idea didn't make Evelyn feel lonely. It made her feel free. The night of the gala, Jonathan stood in front of the mirror in the master bedroom adjusting his cufflinks. He had bought a new tuxedo for the occasion, darker than his old one, more expensive, the kind of tuxedo he thought made him look important. Downstairs, he could hear Vanessa laughing. She had arrived 20 minutes earlier, all perfume and polished confidence, carrying a silver clutch and acting like she belonged there. Jonathan came down the stairs and stopped when he saw her standing in the foyer. She was wearing the silver dress, the same silver dress Evelyn had circled in that magazine months ago. For 1 second, something uncomfortable moved through him. Then, Vanessa smiled. "What?" "Nothing," Jonathan said. "You look incredible." Vanessa walked toward him slowly. The dress caught the light every time she moved. "I had to," she said. "You said this was a big night." Jonathan slipped his arm around her waist. "It is." Outside, a black car waited in the driveway. By the time they pulled up to the Fontainebleau, Camera flashes were already going off at the entrance. The Bennett Foundation Winter Gala always made the local papers. Politicians, athletes, business owners, old Miami money. Jonathan stepped out of the car and immediately straightened his jacket. Vanessa slid her hand into the crook of his arm. For a second, as the flashes hit them and the valet smiled and held open the door, Jonathan felt exactly the way he had been chasing for years. Admired, successful, like he had finally become the man he always wanted to be. Inside, the ballroom entrance glittered with crystal chandeliers and white orchids arranged in enormous glass vases. A string quartet played near the staircase. Women in gowns drifted through the room, holding champagne. Jonathan recognized several people immediately. A developer he had been trying to impress for months, a city commissioner, an investor who had once ignored his calls. Tonight, all of them smiled at him. "Jonathan," one man said warmly, shaking his hand. "Good to see you." "Congratulations on the expansion," another said. Jonathan grinned. "Thank you. We're doing good things." Vanessa stayed close beside him, smiling at everyone. Every time someone looked at her, she leaned into Jonathan a little more. Jonathan mistook every smile for respect. He didn't notice that several people looked past him immediately after greeting him. Didn't notice that when they asked, "Is Evelyn here?" There was something different in their voices. He just kept walking through the room like he belonged at the center of it. An older woman in diamonds touched Jonathan's arm lightly. "You look handsome tonight," she said. Then she looked around the ballroom. "Where is Evelyn?" Jonathan smiled too quickly. "She'll show up eventually." The woman nodded politely, but her face changed in a way he didn't understand. A few minutes later, Jonathan and Vanessa stopped near the champagne tower. Vanessa adjusted the strap of her dress. "People really know you here." Jonathan looked around the room. "I told you." The truth was, he had always assumed he earned these invitations himself. The deals, the introductions, the warm smiles from people with money and influence. He had never stopped to wonder why those same people always seemed more interested in talking to Evelyn than him. Then suddenly, the room shifted. It wasn't obvious at first, just a small change in the air. People near the entrance started turning. The older couple beside Jonathan stopped talking. The city commissioner smiled toward the door. Jonathan looked up. Evelyn had arrived. She stood at the top of the marble staircase for one quiet second before she started down. She wasn't wearing anything flashy. No diamonds, no silver gown, just a simple black dress. Lorraine's dress, the one with the elegant neckline and long sleeves that made Evelyn look older somehow, stronger. The gold bracelet sat against her wrist. Her hair was pulled back, and for the first time in years, she looked like a woman who wasn't waiting for permission to take up space. People moved toward her immediately. An older man near the staircase smiled. "Evelyn." Another woman kissed her cheek. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you." Someone else touched her arm gently. "We've missed you." Jonathan watched all of it with a strange tight feeling in his chest. Vanessa noticed too. "Why are people acting like she's the Queen of England?" she asked lightly. Jonathan laughed. "Because people like her." But even as he said it, he knew that wasn't right. This wasn't politeness. This was respect, the kind that had nothing to do with him. Evelyn looked across the room and saw him. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Jonathan straightened his shoulders. He still had Vanessa on his arm. He still had the room. At least he thought he did. "Come on," he said. They crossed the ballroom toward her. As they got closer, Jonathan saw Evelyn's eyes flick briefly toward Vanessa's dress. Just once, then back to his face. "You really came?" Jonathan said. Evelyn said nothing. Vanessa smiled beside him, waiting. Jonathan looked Evelyn up and down. She looked beautiful. Tired, maybe, but beautiful. And suddenly, for reasons he didn't want to think about, that made him angry. He gave a small laugh. "You look sad, Evelyn." A few people nearby went quiet. Jonathan kept going. "Honestly, this is getting embarrassing." Vanessa laughed softly. Jonathan leaned closer. "Did you come here to remind me what bad decisions look like?" Silence. Even Vanessa stopped smiling for a second. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. There was no anger left in her face, no pleading, no hurt, just something calm. something that made Jonathan feel for one strange second like he had missed something important. Then, Evelyn glanced once at Vanessa's silver dress. When she spoke, her voice was soft. "Enjoy your evening, Jonathan." Then she turned and walked away, and all across the ballroom, people watched her go. Jonathan stood there for a second after Evelyn walked away. Vanessa shifted beside him and took another sip of champagne. "Well," she said lightly, "that was awkward." Jonathan forced a laugh. "She's being dramatic." But even as he said it, he kept watching Evelyn across the room. She moved through the ballroom slowly, stopping to speak to people Jonathan had spent years trying to impress. An older man with a silver cane smiled when he saw her and kissed her hand. A woman Jonathan recognized from local television hugged her tightly. The city commissioner left a conversation in the middle of a sentence just to walk over to her. Everywhere Evelyn went, people seemed relieved to see her. Jonathan tried to ignore it. Instead, he ordered another drink. The ballroom doors opened wider as more guests arrived. Music drifted through the room. Crystal glasses clinked. Waiters moved between tables carrying trays of crab cakes and champagne. Vanessa touched Jonathan's arm. "Relax," she said. "You're the one everybody's talking to." Jonathan looked around. People were talking to him. But suddenly, he couldn't stop noticing that every conversation eventually circled back to Evelyn. "Have you seen Evelyn tonight? How's Lorraine doing? Tell Evelyn I want to speak with her before the program starts." It irritated him more than it should have. By the time everyone moved into the ballroom for dinner, Jonathan had already had 3 drinks. He and Vanessa sat near the front at a table with investors, developers, and a retired athlete Jonathan had been trying to do business with for months. Jonathan smiled when he saw the seating card, right near the stage, exactly where important people sat. Vanessa leaned over and whispered, "I told you, this is your crowd." Jonathan smiled. Across the room, he saw Evelyn take her seat at a table closer to the center. Several older guests stood when she sat down. One woman squeezed her hand before taking the seat beside her. Jonathan frowned. "Why is she sitting there?" Vanessa asked. "I don't know." But he did know, or at least part of him did. He had known for years that people treated Evelyn differently. He just never wanted to think too hard about why. The lights dimmed. A man stepped onto the stage beside the podium. The room quieted. "Good evening," he said, "and welcome to the Bennett Foundation Winter Gala." Polite applause. Jonathan loosened his tie slightly and reached for his wine. The announcer thanked the sponsors first, then the donors. Then he started naming people in the room. Jonathan barely listened. He was busy checking his phone under the table. Vanessa leaned close beside him. "You think anybody noticed my dress?" Jonathan looked up and smiled at her. "Everybody noticed your dress." She grinned. Then the announcer's voice changed. "And before we continue, tonight we want to recognize someone whose leadership has carried the Bennett Foundation into a new generation." Jonathan looked up automatically. Across the room, Evelyn sat very still. The man smiled toward her. "Evelyn Bennett Walker." The room changed. It happened all at once. People stood, not a few people, almost everyone. The older couple near the stage, the city commissioner, the retired athlete, the investors, even the people Jonathan had spent the entire evening trying to impress. They stood and applauded. Some of them smiled at Evelyn with something close to affection. Others looked proud. Jonathan stared. Vanessa looked around in confusion. "What is happening?" Jonathan didn't answer, because he didn't know. Evelyn stood slowly. The black dress caught the light as she moved. For 1 second, she looked exactly like Lorraine. Calm, elegant, untouchable. As Evelyn walked toward the stage, people reached for her hands. One man said, "Your grandmother would be so proud." Another woman kissed her cheek. Jonathan felt something cold and ugly twist in his stomach. The announcer smiled. "For those of you who may not know, Evelyn Bennett Walker has served as majority owner and chair of the Bennett Foundation for the past year, following the illness of her grandmother, Lorraine Bennett." The words hit Jonathan like a physical thing. Majority owner, chair. Jonathan stared at the stage. Beside him, Vanessa slowly lowered her champagne glass. "You didn't tell me that," she said quietly. Jonathan looked at her. "I didn't know." Vanessa blinked. "You didn't know?" "No, he didn't." He didn't know because he had never asked, because every time Evelyn tried to talk about her family or Lorraine or the foundation, he found a way to make the conversation about himself, because he had spent years assuming whatever mattered in their marriage belonged to him. On stage, the announcer kept talking. Under Evelyn's leadership, the foundation has expanded its scholarship program, increased affordable housing initiatives, and funded more than 30 small businesses across South Florida. Behind Evelyn, a giant screen lit up. Photographs filled it. Lorraine standing in front of an old hotel, a younger Evelyn helping unload boxes at a food drive, Evelyn in a hard hat at a construction site, Evelyn standing at a podium beside community leaders, Evelyn again and again doing the work. Jonathan looked around the ballroom. Nobody was looking at him anymore. For the first time in years, he felt exactly what he had spent so much energy trying not to feel: small. Vanessa shifted in her seat. "You said you built everything," she whispered. Jonathan didn't answer, because suddenly he wasn't sure what he had actually built at all. Evelyn reached the podium. The applause slowly faded. She stood there for a moment, with one hand resting lightly against the microphone. Then she looked out at the room. Her eyes moved across the crowd, across the tables, across Jonathan, and when she looked at him, there was no anger in her face. That was somehow worse. Jonathan leaned forward in his chair. His voice came out quieter than he meant it to. "What is happening?" Evelyn stood at the podium with both hands resting lightly against the sides. The ballroom had gone so quiet Jonathan could hear the soft buzz of the microphone. For 1 second, she looked down. When she looked back up, her face was calm. "Thank you," she said. Her voice carried easily through the room. "When my grandmother started this foundation, she did not have very much." Behind her, the giant screen showed an old photograph of Lorraine standing outside a small motel near Miami Beach in 1978. The sign behind her was missing 2 letters. Lorraine was smiling anyway. Evelyn glanced toward the image. She had 1 property, 2 employees, and a belief that if you build something with enough care, you can change more than your own life. The screen changed again. Restaurants, hotels, community centers, children holding scholarship certificates, a church food drive, an apartment building with a ribbon stretched across the front. Jonathan stared. He had seen some of those places before. He just never understood they were all connected. "My grandmother taught me that legacy is not about what you own," Evelyn said. "It's about what you protect, what you build for other people, what you leave behind when nobody is watching." A few people nodded. Lorraine sat at the center table in her wheelchair, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She never looked at Jonathan. Evelyn kept speaking. "There was a time in my life when I thought loving someone meant protecting them from every consequence." Jonathan felt his stomach tighten. Across the table, Vanessa shifted in her chair. "I thought if I was patient enough, if I forgave enough, if I made myself smaller, eventually they would remember who they promised to be." The room stayed silent. Jonathan looked down at the tablecloth. For a second, he wanted to leave, but he couldn't move. "I was wrong." The words landed softly. That was the worst part. She wasn't angry. She wasn't trying to hurt him. She was just telling the truth. The screen behind her changed again. Now there were pictures of Evelyn. At 15, carrying folding chairs into a community center. At 23, standing beside Lorraine in front of a hotel renovation. At 30, smiling beside a group of scholarship students. Jonathan stared at the photographs. There were years of Evelyn's life in those pictures. Whole parts of her he had never really seen, because he had never bothered to look. Evelyn took a slow breath. "Over the last year, I have had the honor of becoming chair of this foundation." Applause. Jonathan heard it like it was happening far away. Then Evelyn's voice changed. Still calm, still even, but different. "Unfortunately, in the course of reviewing several business partnerships tied to the foundation, we discovered evidence of serious financial misconduct." The room went still again. Jonathan looked up sharply. Evelyn did not look at him. "There have been unauthorized transfers, misuse of company funds, and fraudulent activity connected to one of the businesses associated with my husband, Jonathan Walker." For one impossible second, Jonathan honestly thought she couldn't mean him. Then people started turning. The retired athlete beside him shifted his chair slightly away. One of the investors lowered his eyes. Vanessa's hand slowly slipped off Jonathan's arm. "No," Jonathan said under his breath. At the side of the ballroom, two lawyers started walking toward him. Jonathan recognized one of them. He had seen him once at Lorraine's house years ago. The lawyer stopped beside the table. "Mr. Walker," he said quietly, "you've been served." He slid a thick envelope in front of Jonathan. Jonathan stared at it, then at Evelyn. "This is insane," he said. Nobody answered, because the room already knew. The investor across from him stood up first. "I think we're done," he said quietly. Then he walked away. Another man followed, then another. Vanessa sat very still beside him. Jonathan turned toward her. "Vanessa." She looked at him differently now. Not angry, embarrassed. "You said your company was yours." "It is." "You said she didn't matter." Jonathan looked toward the stage. Evelyn was still standing there, beautiful, calm, completely out of his reach. "I didn't know," he said. Vanessa laughed once, a short, hard sound. "That's the problem." Then she stood up. Jonathan reached for her wrist. "Vanessa, wait." She looked down at his hand, then back at him. "You should have figured out who mattered before tonight." She pulled away. The silver dress disappeared into the crowd. Jonathan sat there alone. The ballroom around him buzzed softly with whispers. Some people looked at him. Most didn't. The room had already moved on. On stage, Evelyn thanked the guests for their support. She thanked Lorraine. She spoke about the scholarship program and next year's projects and the future of the foundation, like Jonathan no longer existed, and maybe, in the life she was building now, he didn't. Jonathan looked down at the envelope in front of him. His hands were shaking. For years, he had believed Evelyn stayed because she needed him, because without him, she would have nothing. Now he understood the truth. Evelyn had never needed him. He had needed her loyalty, her silence, her love, her name, and he had traded all of it for a woman who was already gone. Across the ballroom, Evelyn stepped away from the podium. People surrounded her immediately. They smiled. They touched her arm. They spoke to her softly. Jonathan stayed where he was, alone at the table, the envelope unopened in front of him, and for the first time in years, he had nowhere to hide. Jonathan stayed at the gala almost an hour after everyone else stopped pretending to care whether he was there. He sat at the table with the envelope in front of him and an untouched glass of whiskey beside it. Around him, the ballroom slowly emptied. People said goodbye to Evelyn. They kissed Lorraine on the cheek. Nobody came to Jonathan. Twice, he thought about walking over to Evelyn. Twice, he stood up. Twice, he saw the people surrounding her and sat back down. By the time he finally left, the valet wouldn't meet his eyes. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Miami looked different at night when you had nowhere to go. The city lights blurred against the windshield. The radio played softly until Jonathan turned it off. At a red light on Biscayne Boulevard, he reached automatically for his phone. Vanessa. He called once. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Then a text appeared. "Don't call me again." Jonathan stared at the screen. Then he laughed once. A short, empty sound. By the time he pulled into the driveway, it was almost 2 in the morning. The house was dark. For a second, he sat in the car with the engine running. Usually when he came home late, there would be one lamp on in the kitchen. Evelyn always left that light on, even after the nights they fought, even after she stopped waiting up for him. The lamp would still be there. Tonight, the house was black. Jonathan unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Evelyn? Nothing. The silence in the house felt wrong. He tossed his keys onto the table in the hallway. They hit the wood too loudly. Evelyn? Still nothing. He walked through the downstairs slowly. The kitchen was clean. Too clean. No mug in the sink. No half-finished tea on the counter. No magazine folded open beside the fruit bowl. The kitchen island where Evelyn used to sit was empty. Jonathan walked upstairs. The bedroom door was open. He stopped in the doorway. Half of Evelyn's clothes were gone. The side of the closet where she kept her dresses looked strangely bare. The drawers where she kept her jewelry stood open. The black dress from tonight was gone too. Jonathan crossed the room slowly. Her perfume bottle was missing from the dresser. The framed photograph of them at their wedding, the one Evelyn always kept beside the mirror, was gone. Only the lighter square where it used to sit remained. "No," Jonathan said softly. He walked back into the hallway. The large wedding photo that had hung beside the stairs for years was gone too. He stared at the empty nail in the wall. Then he noticed something else. The guest room door was open. Inside, 2 suitcases were gone from the closet. Jonathan sat down hard on the edge of the bed. For a long time, he just stared. He had spent so many years acting like Evelyn would always stay, like no matter what he said, what he did, how badly he hurt her, she would still be there in the kitchen, still waiting, still forgiving him. He thought about the silver dress, the way Evelyn had looked at Vanessa, and then at him, not angry, finished. Jonathan stood up too quickly and nearly knocked over the lamp beside the bed. He grabbed his phone and called Evelyn. Once, twice, 3 times, straight to voicemail. Evelyn, come on. He called again, then again, nothing. Finally, after the 7th call, he left a message. Evelyn, please, just call me back. His voice sounded strange to him, smaller, scared. He hung up and stood alone in the bedroom. Then, for reasons he couldn't explain, he walked downstairs to the kitchen. He sat at the table where Evelyn used to sit at midnight with cold tea and unpaid bills while he stayed out too late. The same table where she had shown him the hotel charge. The same table where she had smiled when he brought home white roses, even though she already knew. Jonathan looked around the kitchen, and for the first time in years, he saw it the way Evelyn must have. The flowers she kept replacing every week because she liked the house to feel warm. The stack of mail she always sorted because he never did. The coffee mug in the cabinet with a small chip in the handle because it was Lorraine's favorite, and Evelyn refused to throw it away. Everywhere he looked, there was evidence of her. The life she had built quietly around him while he chased things that never made him happy. Jonathan put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands against his face. Then the memories came all at once. Evelyn laughing in that flooded apartment with paint on her hands. Evelyn crying in the hospital while he held her. Evelyn waiting by the window when he drove 4 hours for peach cobbler. Evelyn sitting in bed asking, "Do you ever think about the baby?" Evelyn standing in the ballroom tonight in Lorraine's black dress. "Enjoy your evening, Jonathan." He lowered his hands. There was a legal envelope still tucked under his arm from the gala. He hadn't even opened it. Slowly, he pulled it out and set it on the table. Divorce papers, financial records, court filings. There was a copy of 1 page clipped to the front. Jonathan stared at the line near the bottom. Petitioner, Evelyn Bennett Walker. For years he had called her Evelyn Walker. Like the rest of her, didn't matter. Like the Bennett part was just something extra. Now, he understood. That was the part of her he never really saw. The strongest part, the part that survived him. Jonathan looked around the empty kitchen one more time. Then he finally broke. He put his head in his hands and cried alone at the table where Evelyn used to wait for him. Jonathan woke up at the kitchen table just after sunrise. His neck hurt. His tuxedo jacket was still on the floor beside him. For a second, he forgot. Then he looked up at the empty house. The half-open legal envelope, the missing wedding photo, and everything came back. He grabbed his phone. No missed calls. No texts from Evelyn. Nothing. He called her before he even stood up. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. By the 4th call, he wasn't even sure what he planned to say. He just needed to hear her voice. "Evelyn," he said after the tone, "please, just call me back, please." He drove to her office that afternoon. Not his office, the foundation office. The office he had never even realized she had. It sat in an old building near downtown Miami with dark wood floors and framed black and white photographs on the walls. Jonathan stood outside in yesterday's clothes, watching people go in and out. Every person who passed seemed to know exactly who Evelyn was. Around noon, he finally saw her through the front glass doors. She was walking beside a woman from the gala, holding a folder against her chest. She looked tired, but she also looked different, lighter, like she had put down something heavy. Jonathan pushed through the door. "Evelyn." She stopped. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Evelyn looked at the woman beside her. "Can you give us a minute?" The woman nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Jonathan stepped closer. "I've been calling you." "I know. You left." Evelyn looked at him quietly. "Yes." Jonathan swallowed. "I didn't know about the foundation." The second the words came out, he hated himself for them, because somehow, even now, he was still making this about him not knowing. Evelyn looked away for a moment. No, she said softly. You didn't. Jonathan took a step closer. I'm sorry. Evelyn said nothing. I messed up. You did. I don't know what happened. Evelyn looked at him then. For the first time, there was something in her face he hadn't seen before. Not anger, not sadness, just honesty. You know what happened, Jonathan. The silence between them felt unbearable. People moved through the hallway behind them. Phones rang in another office. The world kept going. Jonathan lowered his voice. I love you. Evelyn closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she opened them again. I have a meeting. And she walked away. Jonathan stood there, watching her disappear down the hallway. That night, he sent flowers, white roses, the same ones he had brought home the week before. The florist called an hour later. She refused delivery. The next day, he sent a letter. Evelyn, I know you don't want to talk to me. I know I don't deserve it. But please, let me explain. Nothing happened the way it looks. Even as he wrote the sentence, he crossed it out. Because it had happened exactly the way it looked. He crumpled the page and started over. For the next 2 weeks, Jonathan called every day. Sometimes twice, sometimes 10 times. He left voicemails from the car, from his office, from the kitchen in the middle of the night. No answer. Meanwhile, his life kept getting smaller. The investor from the Gala stopped returning his calls. The bank delayed his loan. 2 projects fell apart in the same week. Jonathan walked into his office one Monday morning and realized half the desks were empty. People had left, or maybe they had just stopped believing in him. He sat alone in the conference room, staring at the glass walls and the city below. For years, he had believed he was the reason for everything good in his life. The company, the house, the invitations, the respect. Now he wasn't so sure. That evening, he drove past the house Lorraine owned in Coconut Grove. Evelyn's car was in the driveway. Jonathan sat across the street with the engine running. Through the front window, he could see Evelyn standing in the kitchen. She was laughing. Lorraine was sitting at the table, smiling up at her. For a second, Jonathan just watched. Then Evelyn leaned against the counter and tucked her hair behind her ear the way she always did when she was relaxed. He had not seen her look like that in years, and suddenly he understood something that hurt worse than anything else. Evelyn had not become cold. She had become cold with him, because he had spent years making her feel lonely inside her own marriage. The next morning, Jonathan sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad in front of him. Outside, rain hit the windows in slow, steady drops. He thought about the flooded apartment, the peach cobbler, the baby onesie hidden in the dresser drawer. He thought about every time Evelyn had tried to tell him she was hurting, every time he had made her feel like too much, or not enough. Then he picked up the pen. Dear Evelyn, I think I spent so many years being afraid that I wasn't enough that I started treating you like you were the reason I felt small. You loved me when I had nothing, and instead of being grateful, I kept needing more money, more attention, more proof that I mattered. I told myself I deserved it because I worked hard. But the truth is, I loved what you gave me more than I loved you. I loved feeling important. I loved that people respected me because I stood beside you. I loved the life you helped build, and I was too selfish to admit that without you, I don't know who I am anymore. Jonathan stopped writing. His hands were shaking. For a long time, he stared at the letter. Then he folded it slowly and slid it into an envelope. On the front, in careful handwriting, he wrote, Evelyn Bennett Walker. 3 days after Jonathan mailed the letter, his phone rang just after 6 in the morning. He had been awake already. He had barely slept in weeks. For 1 second, when he saw Evelyn's name on the screen, he forgot how to breathe. He answered too fast. Evelyn? Her voice was quiet. South Point Park, 7:30. Then she hung up. Jonathan stood in the kitchen staring at the phone in his hand. The sun had not come up yet. Outside, the sky was still dark gray. By 7:15, he was parked near the water. The wind coming off the ocean was colder than he expected. South Point Park was almost empty that early. A man jogged past with headphones in. 2 women sat on a bench drinking coffee. The waves hit the rocks hard below the path. Jonathan saw Evelyn before she saw him. She stood near the edge of the water in a long tan coat with her hands in her pockets. Her hair moved in the wind. For a second, He just watched her. Then he walked toward her slowly. Evelyn turned when she heard him. Neither of them spoke at first. Jonathan stopped a few feet away. "You came," he said. Evelyn looked back toward the water. "You asked." The silence between them felt different now, not angry, just tired. Jonathan shoved his hands into his coat pockets because he didn't know what else to do with them. "I got your voicemail," Evelyn said. "I left a lot of them." "I know, and the flowers. I didn't keep them." Jonathan looked down. "I figured." The wind pushed her hair across her face. She tucked it behind her ear, the same way she always had. Jonathan swallowed hard. "I read the letter." Evelyn's voice was soft. Jonathan looked at her. "And?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "It was the first honest thing you've said in a long time." The words hurt because they were true. Jonathan stepped closer. "I mean it, Evelyn. I know. I still love you." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she looked older somehow, not because of age, because of everything she had carried. "Jonathan," she said quietly, "love is not enough when somebody keeps choosing to hurt you." He stared at her. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "No," Evelyn said. "You just kept doing it anyway." Jonathan looked away. The ocean crashed against the rocks below them. Somewhere behind them, a child laughed. The world kept moving. "I know I messed up," Jonathan said finally. "I know I was selfish. I know I ruined everything, but people change." Evelyn looked at him carefully. "They do. Then why can't you believe I can?" For a second, she didn't answer. Then she looked out toward the water again. "Because I spent years believing that." Jonathan felt his throat tighten. "I kept waiting for you to come back," Evelyn said softly. "The man in the apartment with paint all over his face. The man who drove 4 hours for peach cobbler because my grandmother liked it." Jonathan shut his eyes. "I know, but every time I tried to tell you I was hurting, you made me feel like I was the problem." He shook his head immediately. "No. You told me I didn't understand pressure. You told me I used to be more fun. You stood in front of people and made me feel small." Jonathan looked down at the ground. Because there was nothing to say. Every word was true. "You know the saddest part?" Evelyn asked. He looked up. "I stayed." The wind caught the edge of her coat. "I stayed after the affair. I stayed after the lies. I stayed after you made me feel lonely in my own house." Jonathan's face twisted. "Evelyn!" "No, listen." Her voice did not rise. That somehow made it harder. "I stayed because I thought marriage meant fighting for each other." Tears filled Jonathan's eyes. "But somewhere along the way," she said, "you stopped fighting for me." He covered his mouth with one hand. "I was stupid. You were selfish." He nodded once. "Yes." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Jonathan asked the question he had been carrying for weeks. "Is there any chance at all?" Evelyn looked at him. There were tears in her eyes too, but she did not look uncertain. "No." The words sat between them. Jonathan felt something inside him finally break. Evelyn took a slow breath. "I forgave you a long time ago." He stared at her. "What?" "I forgave you before the gala, before the lawyers, before any of it." Jonathan looked confused. "Then why?" "Because forgiveness doesn't mean I have to stay." The ocean crashed below them again. "I stopped waiting for you to become the man you promised to be." Jonathan lowered his head. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to defend. No excuse, no explanation, just the truth. He had spent years acting like Evelyn would never leave, and now she was standing in front of him. Already gone. Jonathan started crying, not the quiet tears from the kitchen table. This was different. Messier, the kind of crying that comes when there is nothing left to hold on to. Evelyn watched him for a moment. Then she stepped closer, not to hold him, just enough to speak softly. "I hope one day you become the man I thought I married." Jonathan looked up at her through tears. Then Evelyn turned and walked away. She did not look back. Jonathan stood alone beside the water long after she was gone. Jonathan stood beside the water at South Point Park until the sun came up. By the time he finally got back to his car, his face hurt from crying, and his phone battery was almost dead. He never called Evelyn again, not because he stopped wanting to, because he finally understood she meant it. The divorce moved quickly after that. Evelyn's lawyers handled everything quietly. The house in Coconut Grove was sold. The accounts Jonathan had hidden became part of the investigation. 2 of his former business partners testified that he had moved money through company accounts without approval. By the end of the summer, Jonathan's company was barely holding on. The office that used to feel important suddenly looked cheap and tired. The lobby plants were dead. Half the lights in the conference room didn't work anymore. One morning, Jonathan walked into the office and found another resignation letter on his desk. He didn't even have to open it to know what it said. People stopped calling. The same men who used to slap him on the back at dinners and invite him golfing suddenly had other plans. His phone stayed silent for entire days. Even his brother stopped answering as often. At first, Jonathan told himself everybody was unfair, that Evelyn had ruined him, that the foundation had turned people against him. Then one afternoon, sitting alone in his empty office, he caught his reflection in the dark computer screen. For a second, he saw himself the way Evelyn must have seen him, a man who blamed everyone else because it was easier than admitting he had done this to himself. 3 months later, Jonathan moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Brickell. It was clean, small, too quiet. The couch came from a discount furniture store. The kitchen table only had 2 chairs. At night, the refrigerator hummed louder than it should have. Sometimes Jonathan sat on the tiny balcony and looked out at the city lights and thought about the house. The lamp Evelyn always left on, the smell of coffee in the mornings, the sound of her humming quietly in the kitchen when she thought nobody could hear her. Those were the things he missed most. Not the house, not the money, her. One Thursday afternoon, Jonathan sat in the waiting room of a therapist's office. He had almost canceled 3 times. The room smelled like peppermint tea and old books. When the therapist opened the door and said his name, Jonathan nearly stood up and left. Instead, he followed her down the hallway. The first few sessions were terrible. Jonathan sat stiffly in the chair with his arms crossed. He talked about work, about stress, about Evelyn leaving. The therapist listened quietly. Then one day she asked, "When did you first start believing you had to be important to deserve love?" Jonathan stared at her. For a second, he almost laughed. Then he didn't, because suddenly he was 12 years old again, standing in the kitchen of his childhood house while his father shouted that nobody respected weak men. He was 17, watching his mother stay with someone who made her feel small because she thought she had nowhere else to go. He was 29 in a flooded apartment with paint on his hands, and a woman who loved him before he had anything. Jonathan leaned forward and covered his face. For the first time in his life, there was nobody left to blame. Not his father, not work, not Evelyn, just him. That night, Jonathan drove home through the rain. The apartment felt colder than usual. He loosened his tie and walked into the bedroom. Most of his things were still packed in boxes because he never really knew where to put them. He opened one of the boxes, looking for a phone charger. Instead, he found an old wooden dresser drawer he had shoved inside during the move. The same drawer from the house. Jonathan sat on the floor. For a second, he just stared at it. Then, he pulled it open slowly. Inside were old papers, a receipt from the Cuban restaurant they used to order from in Coral Gables, a faded photograph of him and Evelyn at the beach years ago, and at the very back, folded carefully beneath an old t-shirt, was the tiny green and orange University of Miami football onesie. Jonathan froze. He picked it up slowly. It was smaller than he remembered. The little sleeves, the soft fabric. For years he had told himself the miscarriage changed everything, that after they lost the baby, Evelyn became distant, quiet, harder to reach. But sitting there on the floor of that tiny apartment, holding the onesie in his hands, Jonathan understood something he had been too selfish to see. Evelyn had been hurting too. She had been waiting for him to grieve with her, to stay. Instead, he ran toward work and money and attention because he did not know how to sit inside something painful. And when Evelyn needed him most, he made her feel alone. Jonathan lowered his head. The apartment was silent, except for the rain hitting the windows. He held the onesie against his chest and cried harder than he had at the gala, because money had not ruined his life. Vanessa had not ruined his life. Evelyn had not ruined his life. He had and there was nothing left to hide behind anymore. Jonathan cried until the rain stopped. Across the city, Evelyn was asleep in Lorraine's guest room, with the windows cracked open and the sound of the water moving softly beyond the porch. For the first time in years, she slept through the night. The months after the divorce did not feel the way she expected. There was no dramatic moment where she suddenly felt healed. Some mornings she still woke up and reached for Jonathan before remembering. Some nights she still sat in the driveway too long before going inside. Grief did not disappear just because you finally chose yourself, but slowly, quietly, her life started becoming hers again. In September, Evelyn flew to Charleston for 3 days because she had always wanted to go, and Jonathan used to say it was boring. She walked through quiet streets lined with old houses and sat alone in a restaurant by the water, eating shrimp and grits with a glass of wine. Nobody knew her there. Nobody asked about the divorce. The second night, she bought a notebook from a little shop near King Street and wrote one sentence on the first page. "I do not want to spend the rest of my life apologizing for needing more." When she came home, Lorraine was waiting on the porch with 2 glasses of sweet tea. "How was Charleston?" Lorraine asked. Evelyn sat down beside her. "I walked for 3 hours and bought a candle that smells like cedar." Lorraine nodded seriously. "Sounds life-changing." Evelyn laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprised her because she had not heard it from herself in a long time. Lorraine smiled, but did not say anything. She knew better than anyone that healing happened quietly. By October, Evelyn was spending most of her time at the foundation, not hiding in the office the way she had in the first weeks after the gala. Actually leading, she sat in meetings, she made decisions. She visited the scholarship program Lorraine had started years earlier. One Friday afternoon, she stood in a community center in Liberty City, talking to a group of young black women who wanted to start their own businesses. One wanted to open a bakery. Another wanted to start a clothing company. A third wanted to create an after-school program for girls. They looked nervous when they spoke, like they were afraid wanting too much would make them selfish. Evelyn knew that feeling. After the meeting, one of the girls lingered behind. She could not have been more than 22. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. How do you know when you're strong enough?" Evelyn looked at her for a second. Then she smiled softly. "You don't," she said. "You just get tired of letting people convince you that you're weak." The girl nodded slowly. Evelyn thought about that conversation all the way home. For years, Jonathan had made her feel like she was difficult to love because she wanted honesty, because she wanted him to show up, because she wanted more than being tolerated. Now, sitting in traffic with the windows down and the radio playing softly, she realized something. She had never been asking for too much. She had just been asking the wrong person. In November, Evelyn met 2 old friends for dinner in Miami Beach. Women she had slowly lost touch with during the marriage because Jonathan always found a reason not to go, or complained after, or made her feel guilty for enjoying herself. The restaurant was noisy and warm. There were candles on the table and too much bread, and a waiter who kept refilling their wine glasses. At first, Evelyn felt awkward, like she had forgotten how to be part of a conversation that was not about managing someone else's mood. Then one of her friends told a ridiculous story about getting locked out of her car in a grocery store parking lot. The other nearly spilled her drink laughing, and suddenly Evelyn was laughing too, really laughing. Her face hurt from it. Halfway through dinner, one of her friends looked at her across the table. "You seem different." Evelyn reached for her wine glass. Different good or different scary? Different free. For a second, Evelyn did not know what to say. Then she looked down at the table, at the breadcrumbs, the half-finished glass of wine, the text from Lorraine asking if she wanted peach cobbler when she got home. She smiled. Maybe. That night, she drove home with the windows down. Miami felt softer somehow. When she pulled into Lorraine's driveway, the kitchen light was still on. Inside, Lorraine stood at the counter cutting peach cobbler into 2 uneven pieces. "I made too much," she said. "You always make too much." "That's because life is disappointing and dessert helps." Evelyn laughed again. She took the plate and sat at the kitchen table. Lorraine sat across from her. For a few minutes, they ate in comfortable silence. Then Lorraine looked up. "Do you miss him?" Evelyn looked down at the peach cobbler. For a long time, she had been afraid of that question, afraid that if she answered honestly, It would mean she was still trapped in the same old story. But now, sitting in Lorraine's kitchen with cinnamon in the air and the windows open to the water, she thought about Jonathan, the man in the apartment with paint on his face, the man beside the water at South Point Park, the man who had loved her badly because he did not know how to love himself. Then, she thought about the woman she had become without him, and for the first time, the answer came easily. "No," Evelyn said softly, and she realized she meant it. Nearly a year later, Evelyn stood backstage at the Bennett Foundation Winter Gala with Lorraine's gold bracelet fastened around her wrist. The ballroom beyond the curtain sounded familiar. Glasses clinking, people laughing, the low hum of 100 conversations at once. This year she was not nervous. She wore another black dress, simple, elegant, entirely her own. A young assistant stood nearby holding the evening program. "They're ready for you in 5 minutes," she said. Evelyn nodded. Then she stepped closer to the side of the curtain and looked out into the ballroom. The room was full. City officials, business owners, scholarship students, old friends, people Lorraine had known for years. Near the front, Lorraine sat smiling in her wheelchair with a pale blue shawl around her shoulders. Evelyn smiled back. Then, farther in the back of the room, she saw Jonathan. He stood alone near the last table by the wall. For a second, she almost did not recognize him. He looked older, not because of gray hair or wrinkles, because something sharp had finally left him. The expensive confidence was gone, the way he used to carry himself like he deserved more than everyone else. Now he stood with his hands in his pockets, quiet and uncertain. He was wearing a dark suit that did not look new. No Vanessa, no watch worth more than a car, no smile. Jonathan looked toward the stage. Then he saw Evelyn. They held each other's eyes for one brief second. Jonathan gave the smallest nod. Evelyn nodded back. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to. A moment later, the announcer said her name. The ballroom applauded. Evelyn walked onto the stage. The lights were warm against her face. She stood behind the podium and looked out at the room. Then she began, "When I was younger, I thought love meant proving yourself." The room went quiet. "I thought if you gave enough, forgave enough, waited long enough, eventually people would love you the way you deserved." In the back of the room, Jonathan looked down. Evelyn kept going. "But there are some people who will keep taking from you as long as you keep handing them pieces of yourself." The room stayed still, and sometimes the hardest thing you will ever do is stop asking someone to love you better. She glanced toward Lorraine. Lorraine smiled softly. Evelyn took a breath. "For a long time, I believed losing someone meant I had failed." Her voice stayed calm. "But now I know that sometimes losing the wrong person is how you finally find yourself again." A few people wiped at their eyes. One of the scholarship students in the front row reached for her friend's hand. "You are not difficult to love because you ask for honesty," Evelyn said. "You are not asking for too much because you want respect." Jonathan closed his eyes. Evelyn looked across the room one last time. If someone only loves what you do for them, what you give them, or how you make them feel about themselves. She paused. That is not love. That is ownership. The silence afterward felt different, full, like everyone in the room understood exactly what she meant, even if they had never said it out loud before. Then the applause began, slowly at first, then louder. People stood. Lorraine stood too, with help. Evelyn smiled through the applause, not because she needed it, because for the first time in her life, she knew exactly who she was even without it. When she stepped off the stage, people moved toward her. They hugged her. They thanked her. They told her how much the speech meant. In the middle of it all, Evelyn looked toward the back of the room again. Jonathan was gone. He had left quietly before the event ended, and somehow that felt right. Later that night, after the ballroom had emptied and Lorraine had gone home, Evelyn walked outside alone. The water beyond the hotel was dark and calm. A soft breeze moved through the palm trees. She slipped off her heels and stood near the edge of the water. For years, she had believed losing Jonathan would destroy her. Instead, it had brought her back to herself. She touched the gold bracelet on her wrist. Then she looked out across the water and smiled, because she finally understood something that had taken her years to learn. Jonathan had not been the love that saved her life. Losing him was If this story stayed with you, let me know in the comments. Have you ever stayed too long hoping someone would become the person they used to be? And if you believe nobody should have to beg for the love and respect they deserve, subscribe to Mr. Kingswell Stories for more powerful stories about love, betrayal, healing, and finding the strength to choose yourself.